This conference will now be recorded.
All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining our NOAA in the Caribbean Community Group meeting. It's always a pleasure to see this wonderful community. So just a few updates, welcome things before we jump into our presentations here. If this is your first NOAA in the Caribbean Community Group meeting, welcome. We're really excited to have you. If you received this invite from someone else and you are not yet on our listserv, please feel free to fill out this Google form that I just shared, and that will add you to our mailing list if you are not already on it. So please be sure to sign up. You'll receive updates on meetings, timely announcements, also our quarterly newsletter through this listserv. As always, if there's any topics you want to hear or any speakers you'd like to hear from in these community group meetings, things you'd like included in the newsletter or announcements you'd like us to share broadly, please remember to email caribbeannews@noaa.gov. We always are monitoring this and happy to share updates. I will put that email in the chat as well. And one very exciting announcement, you'll hear about this in our last presentation of the day, but just want to share a save the date for our annual partners meeting. Last year, you will remember, this year it was a virtual meeting. Excited to announce that in 2025, this will be an in-person partners meeting in Puerto Rico. More details to come, and you'll hear about it again in another presentation, but this will be during the week of April 29th to May 1st. So very exciting news. Again, just put those dates in the chat and you'll hear more shortly. But with that, we have 3 presenters today, so I don't want to waste any more time and would love to jump right in. So I'm going to turn it over to Lee for updates on marine species and habitats in the U.S. Caribbean protected under the Endangered Species Act. So over to you, Lee.
Thanks so much. Let's see if I can make this work. Okay, is that moving at all? No, it's not. Let's see. Now it is, right? You can see it? Okay, cool. I'm happy this presentation can get shared with everyone, which is why I actually put some hyperlinks in here. But yeah, so I'm going to talk about some of the species that are listed in the U.S. Caribbean and then some of the designated critical habitats. But to get there, I did want to just back up and talk a little bit about the Endangered Species Act. So I guess considering that we're all online, if those of you see the reaction button, whoever actually knows something about the ESA, just give me a thumbs up if you can do that. I just want to see. Okay, a couple of people. More people than I thought. All right. Okay, cool. Then this is just going to be a brief overview, and then we're going to talk about some specific sections. I do want to note that my office is responsible for Section 7 of the Act, but I am going to talk about a few other ones because, as we noted, this is an update on species that are listed in critical habitats that are designated or proposed in the U.S. Caribbean, and that's actually Section 4. So the Endangered Species Act is actually from 1973. And if you read the intent of Congress, it talks about the act being meant to protect species from extinction and conserve the ecosystems on which they depend. It's actually a framework for conservation and protection of endangered and threatened species and their habitat, not just habitat that gets designated as critical. And it is administered by both the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and the National Marine Fisheries Service. What you'll actually see in the act is it talks about the secretaries. Those are the secretaries of Interior, under which the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service falls, and the Secretary of Commerce, under which National Marine Fisheries Service falls. And I work for NIMS. There we go, it's slow. So as I already mentioned, part of the ESA is listing and designation of species. So species can be listed as threatened or endangered. Endangered means already in danger of extinction throughout all of it or a significant portion of the species range. Whereas threatened means it's likely to become endangered within the foreseeable future. And foreseeable future is actually a defined concept in the Act and also in the regulations. In one of the next slides, I actually give you a link to the regulations. But if you're interested, it is part 424 of 50 Code of Federal Register. But like I say, it'll be on the next slide. Critical habitat can also be designated for listed species, whether they're listed as threatened or endangered. And it means specific areas within the geographical area that is already occupied by a listed species at the time of listing, that has physical or biological features essential to the conservation of the species and required special. That's a lot of words. But basically what it means is really important pockets of habitat where essential functions of the species like feeding, breeding, sheltering, those, but they have to be very important areas for the species in order to be considered as critical habitat. There's also another piece to this, which is that critical habitat can actually be designated outside a geographical area that's occupied the species if it's determined to be essential to the conservation of the species. That's not used very much. It's also quite controversial, especially given the administration that's coming in. But there is also a lot of information in the regulations about what this might mean in terms of how to designate that. It is becoming more important, though, with considerations like climate change, because it means that sometimes the services may well consider areas that the species may need to move into as climate change shifts where they might actually be located. So just, again, that is not the area that I work in, but it's important to flag because it has been becoming more and more of an issue given influences like climate change. So what are some major considerations when actually determining, and this, so these considerations are actually in the law. So they're in the ESA in section 4. I put underneath there the regulations that give more details about the requirements for a listing, both determining whether a species is threatened or endangered, and designated critical habitat, but also revising the list, determining whether there may be some shifts in the way species are designated. Are they threatened? Are they endangered? Are they now extinct and they're removed from the list? Or have they recovered and they're removed from the list, which is ultimately the goal under the Endangered Species Act. So, but the main considerations when a species is getting listed is thinking about whether or not there's already some sort of destruction, modification, or curtailment of its habitat or range. Often that is from anthropogenic stressors, things like land use change, development. The next factor is related to, but before I go on, I do want to note that it's an or. So when species get listed, it's not because you have to meet all of these. It's because at least one of these is significant enough to mean that a species is either in danger of extinction or threatened with the potential for extinction in the foreseeable future. So I do think the or is really important, so I want to emphasize that. So anyway, so we talked about habitat destruction. The next one is overutilization for commercial, recreational, scientific, or educational purposes. So a species that has been a target for a fishery, a species that has been a target for collections for whatever reason, whether they are scientific or educational. Disease or predation is another one. And this is another one where a lot of climate change issues have begun to come in for species like corals. Inadequacy of existing regulatory mechanisms. In other words, the established regulatory and management measures that are meant to protect those species are looked at as to whether or not they are actually serving their purpose. Then the next one is natural or man-made factors. This is another one where climate change more recently has been quite a considerable consideration. So I know you can't read this, but like I say, I will give this presentation. I'm happy to share it. But what I want to point out is that all of it has the hyperlinks. So this came from the list that's actually specific to the Southeast for Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. But most of it is taken from the larger species directory that we have. What I want you to note is that, for instance, green sea turtle was originally listed a very long time ago. And at the time it was listed, it was just green sea turtle. More recently, it was divided into what we call distinct population segments. In Puerto Rico, we mostly have the North Atlantic distinct population segments, and that is the one that currently has designated critical habitat. It's around Culebra and its surrounding islands and cays. Again, this is for NIMS because, as I mentioned at the beginning, both Fish and Wildlife and NIMS administer the Endangered Species Act. NIMS has the species when they're wet, so when they're in the water, they're ours. Some of these, like the green sea turtle, Fish and Wildlife also has jurisdiction over when they're dry, when they're nesting. And so I am not talking about the critical habitats that Fish and Wildlife has designated. Those are completely different, and that's not the list that's here. I'm talking only about the resources that my office is responsible for. Important to note. But the reason I was bringing up green sea turtle is that now there's also the South Atlantic DPS, which is largely in Virgin Islands. You can also have some animals from that distinct population segment in Puerto Rico. But the point is that we now have proposed critical habitat for green sea turtle for each of the distinct population segments that are in the U.S. Caribbean. So it will be, if that proposal moves forward, it will be different than what is designated right now. It will not just be critical habitat for green sea turtle around Culebra and its surrounding islands and cays. So I just want to flag that one. The leatherback one for NOAA fisheries for nymphs is only off of St. Croix, Sandy Point. So it doesn't matter for a lot of other considerations in Puerto Rico, for instance. The loggerhead sea turtle critical habitat, there is none in the U.S. Caribbean. It is actually off of Florida and then along the East Coast and some other areas into the Gulf. Hawksbill sea turtle, the designated critical habitat is actually around Mona Island and Monito. Nassau grouper. So this one is recent. That was actually the critical habitat. The grouper was listed as threatened in 2016, also relatively recent, but the critical habitat designation was not completed until January 2024. So, and the reason I'm highlighting these also, if you go to the hyperlinks, it actually describes in detail remember I said early on, the definition of critical habitat, the physical and biological features essential to the conservation of a listed species. So when you look at the critical habitat designations, you can read what all of those features are that led to that habitat being designated as critical for the continued conservation. So it's basically critical habitat is about conservation value for recovering listed species. I do want to also highlight, I'm not going to run through the whole list, but I do want to highlight that for the coral species, elkhorn and staghorn coral were actually listed all the way back in 2006 and then had critical habitat designated in 2008. But the other coral species that were listed in 2014, it wasn't until 2023 that we finalized critical habitat designation. Part of that is because as part of the process, the proposed rules go for public comment. We receive a lot of public comment, really good input. And then in looking through those comments and a lot of the scientific information provided, sometimes we have to revise the proposed critical habitat, and that's what happened in the case of the corals. So it took a while to get the actual final designation of critical habitat done in order to account for all of the scientific information that was provided during the public comment period in part. I also want to highlight, and actually this, I will just flag that this is out of date because there are recovery outlines for the boulder, star coral, mountainous, lobed, and rough cactus coral, and pillar coral. All of those are in a recovery outline, a single recovery outline for those species. So I would just highlight that that is an error in this list. But if you go to the species directory, you can find the recovery outline when you look for these particular species. So the recovery outlines are because whenever we list a species, whether it's threatened or endangered, Again, we're trying to recover them. We want to get them off the list. So we try to come up with recovery plans. What you'll see is that some of them don't have one yet. Some of the older species, they're very, very dated. There are review processes, 5-year reviews that look at these recovery plans and do work towards updating them to the extent possible. But the most recent designations are the ones that have been pretty good at least putting out a recovery outline. What else did I want to see here? There was something else I wanted to say here. Oh, I know what else. The other reason that this list is a little bit out of date, well, no, I guess it's on there. Okay, so for pillar coral is now proposed as endangered. That decision as to whether or not that change in listing from threatened to endangered is supposed to come out very soon. So I just do want to flag that one. Because that will change the status and requirements for that particular coral species. So let's talk about how we use, so that's all about listing. Those are things that are listed, but let's talk just a little bit, this is very, very brief, about using the ESA, then the Endangered Species Act, to actually protect these species and habitats. So one way is Section 6 of the law actually allows for cooperation with the states. And that also does, it says cooperation with states in the Act, but it includes territories and commonwealths. So what this means is that both Fish and Wildlife and National Marine Fisheries Service can have what we call Section 6 agreements with our states and territories. And that allows us to provide the states and territories with funding to support federally listed threatened and endangered species in their jurisdictions. NIMS handles it a little bit differently from Fish and Wildlife. We actually have a proposal process that's competitive, but the bottom line is that is part of a way to help protect listed species and habitats by working with our states and territories. The other one is Section 7. That's actually what my office does. It's interagency cooperation. It is a requirement for federal agencies to use their authorities to further the purpose of the Endangered Species Act. Section 8, international cooperation. That is mostly about things like CITES. So working internationally to try to protect these threatened and endangered species. And I will say NIMS also does have foreign listed species. We have quite a few. So we work obviously very closely with other countries to try to work towards conservation of many of those animals. And then Section 9 is prohibited acts. So things you cannot do for endangered species. Section 9 prohibitions are automatic for endangered species. For threatened species, we have to actually write a rule that again goes back to Section 4, the part that's about listing species. And Section 4D is the part where we can write a rule that extends those Section 9 prohibitions to a threatened species. And then Section 10 is exceptions. And I included Section 10 because some of you may have heard of it before. 10A1A is actually a process for permitting research activities. And I highlight this one because if pillar corals are listed as endangered, then a permit from NIMS for scientific research activities will be required. And for other endangered species that NIMS has under our jurisdiction, it's already required. So some of you may do sea turtle research in the water. Some of you may do some marine mammal work in the water. The 10A1A permits that you get for research, those are our other NIMS division that works with those permits, actually consults with us to issue those permits. And then 10A1B is also another part of that, which is related to incidental take permits. Fish and Wildlife issues a lot more of those than we do in NIMS because a lot of them are related to habitat conservation plans on private lands. And since we're in the water, it's less likely that there isn't a federal nexus. But and then Section 7, again, like I said, this is mostly what we do. So 7A1 is actually a proactive conservation mandate. This is the language of what it actually says in the law about federal agencies shall, so it's a shall. And I only point that out because 7A1, unfortunately, is not used as much as it should be. But this is a way to actually, I mentioned about the recovery plans, the recovery outlines, 7A1 and proactive conservation is a way to really work towards broader scale conservation programs for species. And what needs to be happen here in order for a federal agency to have a 7A1 conservation plan, well, first of all, obviously the agency has to want to do it, but also there does need to be a nexus to the agency's authority and activities that they're carrying out. And there has to be as well a effect of some nature from their activities on listed species and their habitats. So that's 7A1. There are some conservation programs already. The Corps of Engineers has some. FEMA has a big one for their National Flood Insurance Program. So it does happen, but unfortunately, it's not as well used as it could be to work towards recovery of the species. 7A2 is the one that probably most of you are familiar with. This is what everybody thinks about when we think about Section 7 consultation. That's a lot of words. I'm not going to read it. The bottom line is that it just is more about making sure that any of the actions a federal entity undertakes, whether it's authorizing funding or carrying out an action, does not jeopardize the continued existence of a listed species, whether threatened or endangered, or result in the destruction or adverse modification of habitat, of critical habitat. What does that mean? That just means, remember, I talked about critical habitat is designated based on the physical or biological features essential to the conservation of a species. So anything that rises to a level of destroying or adversely modifying those features to agree where that habitat will not serve its conservation value, then is what federal agencies are working towards not doing. And that's part of what we are looking for in our consultations. And again, just like when I mentioned the listing regulations, we have governing regulations for Section 7A2 consultation. So you'll note that I did not put 7A1 here. There are no regulations related to the proactive conservation mandate at this time. But the ones for 7A2 consultation can be found in 50 CFR Part 402. And then the process, which has been in place for a very, very long time, but the part of the consultation process that you may be most familiar with came out with the 1986 regs, came out with changes in 2019 were the big ones, but we did have another change to some language for critical habitat incidental take statements in 2015 and 2016. And then in 2024, we made another change to the regulations to add some offsetting. If you're an ESA nerd like me and you read the preambles, there's a lot of discussion about what the consultation process actually is. And there's also the consultation handbook. I would just note that handbook is extremely dated. It's from 1998. I am on the team that has written the new version, but unfortunately, due to some current litigation and things, it has not come out yet. So no one can see it yet except us, which is really frustrating. But it is still, the overall process has not changed in a very, very long time. So it is still a reasonable guide for doing consultations. And then I put some just general information from our website about doing Section 7 consultations. And that is it. That was a lot of information, but hopefully you got something out of it. And if nothing else, you'll have the presentation with the hyperlinks, so you can also go look for more. I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you so much, Lee. If anyone has any questions, please feel free to come off mute. We have a few minutes here. You can also put them in the chat if you're more comfortable. In the top right-hand corner of your screen, there's things that look like little thought bubbles. You're welcome to input some questions there. And as Lee said, we'll provide the slides afterwards. We'll also provide all notes, and this recording will be available on YouTube as well if you need a refresher at any point. Catherine.
Thanks, Lee. That was a great presentation. I have a question that I'm not sure you may be able to answer, but do you know when the designation for pillar coral is going to go through? Like any day now or not
That's a
yet?
great question. And the reason I say it is because we've actually been working on a programmatic consultation for the research permitting part of it. And it was originally supposed to be finished in September to be in effect by October. It was then pushed off. And I know that it's in the process of pulling the trigger. At the risk of getting in trouble, hopefully we're not still recording, but given the upcoming administration change, they are trying to put it out as soon as possible now. I mean, the rule is ready, so they're trying to put it out as soon as possible so that the effective date is actually live before the inauguration. But it's a different office that's been handling it, but it is ready.
Thank you.
Looks like we have a question in the chat here from Ernesto. How would you explain to the general public the function and effectiveness of the ESA? What are the major challenges for the application of ESA?
That's actually a great question. So function and effectiveness, I would say if you look, there have been a lot of successes in terms of taking animals off of the list. But at the same time, I guess you could say, well, but now there are more and more getting added. But unfortunately, a lot of those reasons for additions are more things like, climate change. But there have also been a lot of really effective partnerships with the state. I think also a lot of Fish and Wildlife, I will admit, Fish and Wildlife does a better job than we do at tooting its own horn and talking about ESA and doing a lot of, public relations and everything else. But I think Endangered Species Act is something that people are very much aware of, which I think is incredibly effective because a lot of citizen science, there are a lot of, monitoring programs, volunteer programs. We have some whale watch programs on the West Coast to track kind of vessel interactions and everything. Citizen scientists are incredibly engaged. So I would say that has been really, really effective. And also from the Section 7 perspective, I've been doing it for a really long time. But I have to say that I don't actually mind my job. We do sometimes have conflicts, but honestly, a lot of it is negotiation skills, and we end up getting some good things for our species more often than not. I think the bad things are what gets highlighted, so that's a challenge. I think some misconceptions about the permitting process is another good challenge. I see somebody just put something about offshore wind. So an interesting fun fact for offshore wind is that we have a dashboard, we NIMS have a dashboard where we're looking at our consultation process, the Marine Mammal Protection Act process, et cetera, related to offshore wind. And what we've found is in over 95% of the cases, we are 100% on time in terms of timeline compliance. We get our consultations done, we get the information done, we negotiate conservation. But the private entities and BOEM, who manages the leases, are very, very late. But because their timeline doesn't get reflected, only ours does, it looks like we're the bad guys. So there's a lot of, I would say there's a lot of bad press, and I wish our agency was really good at proactive communication to actually explain the consultation process better and make it clear that we're doing our job the way we're supposed to be. But so I think that's a significant challenge there. Congress can be a really interesting challenge. Working in the headquarters office, it's amazing the number of inquiries we get, and so much of the information is just wrong. Makes you wish you could go to Congress and just give a whole presentation on what the ESA is. Maybe someday.
Great. And we have time for one final question that I want to switch over just because we have a lot we're trying to fit in today. But the final one is just, was Section 10 permit for non-federally funded authorized actions discussed? And just want to touch on that quickly.
Yeah, so that's the 10A1B piece. If there is no federal nexus, so the federal nexus being a federal entity authorizing funding or carrying out, if there is no federal nexus, but there are concerns related to Endangered Species Act, what we call take of species, then 10A1B is the incidental take permit process for that. And I will just say, though, the issuance of the 10A1B permit is then a federal action. So we do consult with ourselves, and Fish and Wildlife does the same thing, or we consult across the services for the issuance of those permits.
Okay, maybe we can squeeze in one more. Ricardo, I see you have your hand raised. You're welcome to come off mute and ask your question if you'd like. Fortunately, we cannot hear you. I am so sorry.
Okay.
Oh, there we go.
Hello.
Yeah, now we can hear you.
Is there any initiative to include in the ESA corals that lost large populations in the SCCTLD crisis? You know, like Pseudodiplorias.
So, so just briefly, the listing process typically is done based on a petition. So we NIMS, or Fish and Wildlife, if it's a fish and wildlife species, gets a petition requesting that we consider the listing a species. So if there are folks in Puerto Rico, for instance, who have a lot of scientific information about the stony coral tissue loss disease issue and significant losses of coral populations, an option would be to submit a petition for us to consider. We then do what's called a status review and look at whether or not it's merited to consider a species for listing. That is what happened for the other corals that have been listed. And stony coral tissue loss disease, as you probably are aware, is the reason why pillar coral is proposed for uplisting to endangered. So there is a possibility, but unfortunately the services, given workload and capacity and everything else, we don't typically look at all of the species and say, hey, let's consider some of these for listing. We respond to petitions.
Great. Thank you, Lee. We are going to have to go to our next presentation. Lee, thank you for a wonderful presentation. We will share everything after the meeting. And something I should highlight as well, all of our speakers today are a part of the NOAA and the Caribbean executive team. So we're really excited to have some of our leadership in the group here today. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alyssa to talk about NOAA Disaster Preparedness Program. Over to you.
Thank you, Damie. Can you hear me okay? Get a quick
All
yes.
good.
Okay, awesome. So, good morning, buenos dias. Thank you for having me today. I am here today to talk about our disaster preparedness program. It is a relatively new program within the National Ocean Service. We started back in 2017. So I'm hoping to socialize a little bit of what we do and talk about my role and hopefully make some connections in the Caribbean. So if you want to go to the next slide, Damie. So NOAA is a huge organization. So with this graphic, I wanted to point out that our program does sit under the National Ocean Service. So we typically work along the coasts and the Great Lakes. And our vision ultimately is to help make communities and NOAA programs and offices safer through disaster preparation. And so that correlates to both natural disasters and anthropogenic disasters. So pollution events, mainly oil and chemical spills. So like I said, we started back in 2017 after that terrible hurricane season with Maria, Irma, and Harvey, causing a lot of billion-dollar damages throughout many, many communities. That's when NOAA leadership kind of mandated that we are responsible for a lot of internal coordination within the National Ocean Service. But today, I will focus mostly on what we can do for partners within our different regions. I will mention our main kind of hub is our Disaster Response Center located in Mobile, Alabama, which may not be super relevant to our partners in the Caribbean, but for folks that may have some work in the mainland, we are able to host trainings and events. So if that's something of interest in the future, did want to point that out. If you want to go to the next slide. So my role within this program is what we call Regional Preparedness Coordinator. So we have 5 of us coordinators stationed throughout the U.S. to be able to build relationships within different communities because not all disasters are the same throughout the United States. So my region is the Southeast and Caribbean, which is kind of weird because some of my states that I'm responsible for working in are technically mid-Atlantic. So my range is from Delaware down to the US Caribbean. So I do work in Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. But we have folks stationed in Gulf of Mexico, the western coast of the United States, and the Pacific Islands. And I know that this graphic, none of these islands are geographically correctly located, but I did want to highlight that we work in some of these islands. We have someone in Alaska, and then we have someone in the Northeast. And to kind of give some context, 3 out of the 5 of us just started our roles this year. So we are still very much in the phase of building out our relationships and learning what gaps or what work is going on in terms of disaster preparedness and response and restoration within our regions to be able to best serve these communities that we're working with. So if you want to go to the next slide. So I did want to touch on what we can do as a program, but today I will focus on kind of what my role is focusing on in the region. So we work throughout this disaster cycle. So preparedness, and then when a disaster does hit, we do have folks that will respond on scene. For my role, I am not the first person to be tagged to come out to a response operation, but some of our folks are scientific support coordinators. So their roles are split between working with the U.S. Coast Guard to respond to pollution events and working as these regional preparedness coordinators. So that is mainly what we're focusing on is preparedness. We have some folks in response, and then one of our newer roles that we're building out are these regional recovery coordinators. So we work within preparedness and recovery very heavily, and somewhat in response. So I did want to mention that you may not see me on a scene during a disaster, but we are capable of doing that. And I'll talk a little bit more about each of these capabilities in the next few slides. Because like I mentioned, we do have some internal capabilities within the National Ocean Service, but that may not be super relevant to everyone on this call. So I won't focus too heavily on that. So if you want to go to the next slide. So in terms of planning, so we can help folks with building out their disaster response, preparedness, even their hazard mitigation plans. We are able to, if we are not the right folks that have the right expertise or subject matter experts, we are able to help make those connections within NOAA because, like I mentioned, we are a huge organization. So a big part of our role is having a very general understanding of very different parts within NOAA and knowing that maybe our partners would be better suited to work with a different program or a different person that may have expertise in a certain tool or a certain resource. So, for example, we just heard from Lee about ESA. So if we are speaking to a partner and they want to dive deep into the ESA and some consultations and things like that, I know to be able to contact Lee. So that's part of our role. If we want to go to the next slide, please and thank you. For trainings and workshops, we do have some trainings that occur annually. So this NOAA ICS 300, I'm not sure how many NOAA folks we have on the call, but that is an internal training. So incident command system, that's essentially learning what NOAA does during a disaster. It's kind of deep diving into that. This resource advisor training I highlighted because I'm going to talk a little bit about an event we have going on at the end for next year. And then the science of oil spills and science of chemical releases, those occur every year in different parts of the US. So let's see, I can provide a link at the end of the presentation for our 2025 schedule. So for folks that may be working in response to some of these pollution events, it is a class that is geared toward learning more about the science that comes behind oil spills and what NOAA does in terms of protecting our natural and cultural resources during an event like that. Workshops, I mentioned we have regional preparedness coordinators throughout the US. So we sometimes get funding to be able to host workshops, which again, I will talk about one that we're hosting in the Caribbean next year at the end. But um, they can vary. So it very much depends on what our partners or even internal NOAA staff might need to learn more about or kind of deep dive into or make connections. So depending on what I hear from folks in the Southeast and Caribbean, it might be beneficial for us to host a workshop, or I could even, sit on planning teams to be able to help connect NOAA expertise to help make the workshop better potentially. And then these exercises. So for folks that may not be super involved in the disaster realm, exercises are essentially testing our capabilities before a disaster hits. So it's kind of like simulating a disaster and working through what plans you may have in place to kind of go through and see what might be missing, where communication gaps might exist, where you might need to revisit some parts of your plan so that when a real disaster does hit, you're able to better respond and more quickly recover after that disaster. So I'm able to help support building out those exercises. And we do have some what we call master exercise planners on staff that have done this for many years and have a lot of expertise. Like I mentioned, I'm one of the newer staff on the team. So this is something I am working to get better at in the next year. But it is something that a lot of folks that work in disasters do pretty frequently to be able to make sure that during a real disaster, they are fully capable of responding. If you want to go to the next slide. There we go. So I did mention some of those internal capabilities, and I have this, our National Ocean Service, what we call incident management team. So we are mandated from NOAA for our disaster preparedness program to run this incident management team. But for our partners, that mostly means us as regional preparedness coordinators is staying in touch with people when something does happen. So for example, we had a couple of hurricanes in the Southeast this year and in the Caribbean, Milton and Helene. So when those events are happening, if at any point NOAA personnel infrastructure, or any of our mission areas are going to be affected, we will stand up this incident management team to be able to provide that interagency communication as to what's going on in the region. So part of my role is to be able to know, okay, so if our partners in one state are looking for something that NOAA can provide, like I'll talk about some of those capabilities in just a minute. I'm able to make those connections and pass up to NOAA leadership, like this is what I'm hearing on the ground, this is what our partners are struggling with, things like that. So maintaining what we call situational awareness, just kind of knowing what's going on during a disaster to be able to help partners when they need it. If you want to go to the next slide. I won't focus too heavily on this because this is kind of getting in the weeds, a little bit of the nitty gritty. So if you're not within emergency management, it can be a little confusing. But we have these, what we call pre-scripted mission assignments. Essentially, they're statements of work that will show what NOAA staff can be able to do when we are responding to an incident. So these emergency support functions, they're essentially providing structure for coordinating federal interagency support for a federal response to an incident. So, for example, when a federal disaster is declared in the US, we are able to more efficiently work as a federal family to be able to support our partners. So these pre-scripted mission assignments, what we have is called a coastal advisor. So that's where someone like my role, or a scientific support coordinator, or some other NOAA staff are able to go on scene and support the response because we have that knowledge of what tools and capabilities NOAA has that could more effectively help people respond to a disaster. And then these oil and chemical spill response, those, so I mentioned that some of our regional preparedness coordinators are also scientific support coordinators supporting pollution response. So they will often go on scene to help describe and explain and train responders on different tools that we can use to predict where the oil is going to go and what natural resources it may impact. So if you want to go to the next slide, this is a lot going on this slide, so I won't go into all of it, but these are just some examples of ways that the National Ocean Service can help during a disaster response. So some of our other programs are the experts in these tools. Our disaster preparedness program does not develop any tools. Our role is more so in socializing what we have and describing to partners that this is something we do and can support you with. So if you want to go to the next slide, this what we call coastal inundation dashboard. For example, when a storm is coming, like a hurricane or any sort of tropical system is on the way, we can stand up this dashboard through our Center for Operational Oceanographic Products and Services, which is a mouthful. We call it co-ops. That's the acronym because we love our acronyms here at NOAA. But they'll stand up this dashboard, and what happens, and this is a screenshot from the Caribbean, obviously, of what the dashboard would look like during a non-storm event. And you can see kind of some of the options that you can toggle on and off. You're able to look at just NOAA tide stations. You can look at partner stations. And there's even a new feature where you can see where webcams are located to be able to see what's going on in real time. And so when a storm is incoming, the co-ops will set up what they call a storm dashboard. So it will be a geographically focused look at the stations where the storm might impact. So for example, if a storm is coming towards Puerto Rico, they'll set up the storm dashboard and you can see all the tide stations in real time. And what will happen is those little blue pins, if they are in flood or expected to be in flood status, they will do this little red flashing. So you can kind of stay up to date on what's going on at those tide stations. And if you are someone that works in that specific area, you can monitor the flood levels at those tide stations. If you want to go to the next slide. So we have our Office of Coast Survey. They do hydrographic services. So an example for this one, earlier this year, we had the Francis Scott Key Bridge collapse in Maryland. So our navigation teams were tasked with surveying that channel of the bridge to look for debris and to help partners understand when the channel is clear and safe to be navigated once again. So we have navigation response teams that are able to respond during an incident, and they're stationed throughout the US. And we have what we call navigation managers. So for Puerto Rico and the Caribbean, Nick Alvarado is who would respond on scene during an event to help either survey channels or help respond during the event with other hydrographic services. So you want to go to the next slide. This one is a little more well-known typically, but just to socialize it a little bit, the National Geodetic Survey works with other partners, but we have some airplanes on staff that when a disaster hits, they will oftentimes get tasked by FEMA to go collect aerial imagery. And I will say they are really quick to do this. So sometimes the aerial images will have cloud coverage, but they are able to respond very quickly after an event. So for example, this screenshot is from Hurricane Maria, and it hit Puerto Rico on September 20th in 2017. And these images were taken from September 22nd through the 26th. So very quickly, which is able to help provide that aerial overlook for partners to be able to locate where different destruction may have happened, where different navigation channels may have been impacted, bridges, infrastructure, all kinds of things. You know, it spans the gamut of what you can use these for. But this imagery, I will say, does require a FEMA mission assignment, so they will not fly unless they are assigned. In most cases, sometimes they will have dual missions, where they may be flying for another reason and they can on their way take pictures of other things. But I'm certainly not the expert in what exactly they're doing every single day. So, but that is something that happens. And I did want to mention these are taken from an altitude of 2,500 to 5,000 feet. So you can get pretty good resolution from this imagery. And it looks like Catherine put in the chat some of these links to these tools that I'm talking about. And the last one I will mention, if you want to go to the next slide, Damie, is this IRMA tool. So this is something that my office helps work with, the Office of Response and Restoration. My program is not the expert in this tool, but this tool has a ton of capabilities. And I see a question about aerial photographs available. Yes, I will put a link in the chat. They have a website of all historic images from all the hurricanes and storms that they have taken images of. So I'll put that in the chat for you guys in just a second. But this tool, we call it IRMA, not to be confused with Hurricane Irma. It is the Environmental Response Management application. Like I mentioned, it has a lot of capabilities that could be a whole other presentation. But on this screen, I did want to show kind of this tool. It's relatively new, happened within the last year. It's a slider tool. So you're able to see before and after images. So this was, I believe, Hurricane Idalia from 2023. This is, I think, Louisiana maybe, or Mississippi. Or Florida. It's one of the Gulf coasts. But it's an image where you can see this dock before the hurricane, and then you can see how destroyed it is after the hurricane. So you're able to kind of toggle on and off this view and this imagery. So those are just some of the tools we have. We have a lot more, but again, I don't want to go too deep into a lot of these just for the sake of time. So if you want to go to the next slide. So the last phase of emergency management is this recovery phase. So after a disaster happens, how do communities build back to get back to normal, or what would be a new normal after a disaster hits? So kind of like those emergency support functions I mentioned, we have what are called recovery support functions. And again, those are just kind of the coordinating structure that we have throughout different areas to be able to support local governments, facilitate problem solving, improving access to resources, and then fostering coordination throughout the local community, the state, and then territorial and federal agencies. So our role within recovery, we are not a leading agency for any of these functions. We do have to be mandated from FEMA or the Economic Development Agency or the Department of Interior are the three kind of big players that we typically work with in this recovery phase. So we are a supporting agency, which means if they ask us for something that they're hearing on the ground, or if we hear something on the ground, we're able to pass up those needs and those asks from our partners to be able to help communities recover quicker. So, for example, I mentioned Hurricanes Helene and Milton. We are just now starting to have discussions on how to help these communities recover from these terrible hurricanes that impacted Florida and the Appalachian Mountains. So that is kind of a new area for us. Like I mentioned, we sit under the National Ocean Service, so we are focused most of the time on coasts. But because some of our NOAA offices were impacted by Hurricane Helene, we are working through seeing how we as NOAA can help support those communities inland. So make sure I mentioned all of the important stuff. So essentially we're able to, if you want to go to the next slide, Damie, ways that we can help in recovery. You might have to click a couple times for this one. I think it's 5 times. NOAA has, I mentioned, a ton of resources. If you want to do one more time, I think there's one more. Perfect. Yes. Okay. We have a bunch of resources and capabilities within NOAA where we can help communities use these tools to be able to plan for recovering from these disasters. So data analysis and visualization a lot of times can be used for adaptation planning. So understanding where flooding may have come from the river, where's the best place to build, the hospital back to be able to prevent that from happening again, where it might have been flooded. So looking at where the floodplain might be, looking at where the river might swell in places, things like that. So providing that technical support, that place-based knowledge. So NOAA is nationwide throughout all the territories and states. We have folks stationed almost everywhere. So we are able to build out relationships where we can talk to folks and understand what's going on. So the last thing, we are sometimes able to provide grants and assistance programs that might align with recovery missions. So it's hit or miss. Sometimes we might be able to provide or make connections with a grant that might have already been established before a disaster hit. But now that folks are trying to recover, we might be able to make a connection on where some of that funding may be best used. So those are just some examples. Every disaster is very different. And as I'm learning this recovery process in my first year here, it is something that I feel like building out these relationships before a disaster hits is extremely important. So that's why I'm very happy that I'm able to talk to you guys today. So I will end with a few upcoming events. Thank you, Damie. I mentioned that we do have some trainings that occur annually, and unfortunately, none of these are going to be based in the Caribbean this coming year, but I'll put the link in the chat. In case anyone who is or may be working adjacent to emergency response, the Science of Oil Spills and Science of Chemical Releases classes. These classes are free and open to folks working in this world of response and emergency management. You will just have to pay your travel. But these are some of the dates. That link, you can go there and learn more about what each class is specifically. And if you want to go to the last slide, Damie, I did want to mention we are starting to share out this Caribbean Disaster Preparedness and Response Workshop. So it is coming up really fast. We're going to be at the end of the year pretty quickly. But March 3rd through 6th, 2025 in San Juan, Puerto Rico, we are going to be hosting it at the U.S. Coast Guard base out there in San Juan. So we're going to focus on NOAA preparedness for disaster incidents. So what kind of tools and resources does NOAA have? We're going to be talking with community partners that may have some other tools and services or research projects they may be working on to help folks in the Caribbean better prepare for disasters. So it will be hosted in Puerto Rico, but certainly anyone from the Virgin Islands, we're inviting anyone that may be an emergency responder, working in emergency management, or even folks that may not be affiliated with government organizations that work with communities during disasters. And our goals are to kind of create awareness of some of those common and emerging disaster incidents in the Caribbean. So by emerging disaster incidents, I'm talking more about how we are putting a lot of resources into extreme heat and learning more about what we can do to better respond to extreme heat and help protect people during disaster responses, stay safe and stay healthy while they are still trying to help other people during a disaster response. Because I know Puerto Rico in October went through many, many days, broke records of having 90-degree plus days. So this is something that's going to likely keep happening. So creating that awareness of what may be emerging as resources within NOAA to help keep people safe. And then, of course, improving communications and understanding of those tools and understanding best management practices when responding to incidents. And that is going to result in what we call a resource advisor training. So when folks do respond to these disasters, helping get them trained up to be able to help protect the natural and cultural resources when a disaster does happen. So when, for example, if a hurricane comes and it pushes vessels out to ground on the coral reef structure, for example, what's the best way to get those boats off of the coral reef without causing permanent damage? So that's just an example, but best management practices to understand how to clean up after a disaster. And you do get training that we have heard in the past from our Florida partners, where we have done this training in the past. It does help facilitate talking with contractors and folks that may be on the ground. It does help them understand the long-term damage that can occur if they may not be paying attention to how they are removing vessels or removing debris from these environmentally sensitive areas. So it is something that it can be used as professional development for folks in this field. So yeah, we are still building out the agenda, but I will put my email in the chat as well. So if you are interested in learning more, we don't have a website built out just yet, but feel free to send me an email. I can put you on the list to stay in touch and send out more information for this workshop. And with that, if you want to go to the last slide, that also has my email. But certainly part of my goal with this presentation and working with NOAA in the Caribbean is to build out partnerships in the Caribbean. I am stationed in Charleston, South Carolina, so I don't get to live and work in the Caribbean as much as I would like, but building those relationships is extremely important. So feel free to shoot me an email. Happy to chat, schedule some one-on-one time just to build out some of these relationships. And with that, I will help answer any questions.
Thank you so much, Alyssa. Wonderful presentation. If you have time for one question, as Alyssa's been kind enough to call in from Seattle this morning, and she has to go to the airport after this, so I want to respect your time. But there is one, if you're willing. Does NOAA have any news on updates of firms from FEMA? Will the updates include sea level rise data for next generations of economic development activities along the coast?
That's a good question. So I will say, let's see, I don't have any news on that front right now. But something interesting that I actually learned at this workshop that I'm at in Seattle is we have a new tool within NOAA called the Sea Level Rise Viewer. It is very in-depth. And again, I'm not the expert in this, but it does incorporate a lot of data. And it was a very big partnership with a lot of federal agencies. So it is a massive tool. So I'm happy to make that connection to potentially, yes, thank you, to help understand that and the capabilities that it has, because I think that would probably support some of these updates that you were looking for, Gilberto. And yes, Sharon, I do work with Elizabeth. She is one of our newer team members. So she is the Gulf of Mexico Regional Preparedness Coordinator, and we both work in Florida because Florida does have Atlantic and Gulf Coast, obviously. Yeah.
Yeah, she just joined our regional team in the Gulf of Mexico and reached out to come over and visit. And I was wondering, this brief you gave was really helpful and comprehensive. I wondered if it's the same work she's doing in a different region. Be useful to understand.
That's absolutely, yeah. And if anyone does have work in any other region of the U.S., happy to make connections. We're a very diverse team. We, in terms of our background and experience, we all come from different realms. I come from environmental education. That's where my expertise lies. So we all have different capabilities and strong suits. But yeah, I'm excited to be working in the Caribbean. So happy to make a connection whenever possible.
Well, thank you, Alyssa. We really appreciate this wonderful presentation. She provided her email, so if anyone has any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out. And again, this presentation is being recorded, so you can always follow up. Safe travels, Alyssa. Thank you so much for joining us this morning. All right. And now we are on to our final presentation of the day to talk a little bit about the NOAA and the Caribbean Community Group, what we look like, our history, and where we're going. I'm very excited to introduce Aranzazu. So I will turn it over to you. And this presentation will be in Spanish. However, the slides will be in English. So hope you will enjoy.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Damie. Really appreciate it. Y buenos días a todos. Vamos a hacer un experimento hoy. Voy a dar esta presentación cortita en español. For those of you that are not Spanish speaking, you can follow along. The slides will be in English, so hopefully that will be okay for everyone. Para los que no me conocen, yo soy Aranzazu Lascurain y yo hago enlaces en la región del sureste de Estados Unidos y también Puerto Rico y las Islas Vírgenes. Y yo estoy en el programa de la Oficina para el Manejo Costero. Entonces les quiero dar un repaso cortito sobre NOAA para los que no conocen bien NOAA o quieren saber un poco más sobre los diferentes departamentos y divisiones de la agencia. Pero antes que todo, quería yo dar un señalamiento, por favor. La tormenta tropical Sara, que en este momento está golpeando nuestros vecinos en Centroamérica, Honduras, Belice, Guatemala y México. Entonces, estamos pensando mucho en ellos. Next slide, please, Damie. Ok, wonderful. Entonces, mira, les quiero dar un repaso, ¿qué es la NOAA? Y un poquito un orograma sobre las divisiones, los programas, qué estamos haciendo y llevando a cabo con nuestros colaboradores caribeños y un poco sobre el trabajo, actividades e ideas que hay por venir. Next slide, Damie. Thank you. Bueno, mira, les voy a dar nuestra misión de la NOAA, que realmente es algo larga, pero se los voy a comentar aquí. Es comprender y predecir los cambios climáticos, meteorológicos, oceánicos y costeros y compartir esos conocimientos e información con otros y conservar y gestionar los ecosistemas y recursos costeros y marinos. Que ven, es un poquito largo, pero es bastante complejo también nuestra misión. Aquí al lado derecho les quiero dar a conocer un organigrama sobre la agencia de la NOAA. La parte de arriba es más bien el liderazgo ejecutivo de la agencia, pero quiero que por favor se enfoquen en la parte de abajo, las 6, lo que llamamos line offices, o las 6 divisiones de la NOAA. Entonces eso me voy a enfocar un poquito para darles a conocer el trabajo que se está llevando a cabo por medio de estas divisiones en el Caribe. Ok, next slide, please, Damie. Muy bien, entonces aquí les quiero dar a conocer un producto que tenemos, son estas fichas informativas. Tenemos estas fichas para todos los estados de Estados Unidos más los territorios. Aquí les doy a conocer, pueden escanear este código QR para saber un poquito más sobre el trabajo que se lleva a cabo de la NOAA en las Islas Vírgenes. Y por ejemplo, aquí en rojo, arriba, pueden ver que es el servicio de pescadería, el servicio oceánico nacional y también el servicio meteorológico son los representantes que hay en las Islas Vírgenes y más la oficina de educación también. Y también les quiero decir que ahorita estamos en pleno plan de actualizar estas fichas informativas y vienen en un momento muy próximo, pero mientras pueden ver lo que hay ahorita, la presencia de NOAA en las Islas Vírgenes. Y el siguiente, next one, David, please. Ok, entonces aquí tenemos lo mismo, pero para el territorio de Puerto Rico. Y arriba pueden ver que hay una división más, aún en Puerto Rico. que es Oceanic Atmospheric Research, también está representado en Puerto Rico. Y también les quiero decir una cosita muy importante. Viene una posición más federal para Puerto Rico, para el programa de corales y el programa costanero. Ahorita vamos a empezar a entrevistar puestos, pero ese puesto federal estará puesto allí posiblemente allí en San Juan, Puerto Rico. Next slide, Demi. Y aquí les quiero dar a conocer el personal específicamente debajo de la división de National Ocean Service que hay en el Caribe. Entonces aquí pueden ver los programas, los 7, 8 programas que hay en la presencia en el Caribe. Y, por ejemplo, lástima que no nos puede reunir con nosotros hoy Yaritza Rivera, pero ella es el líder de nuestro grupo ejecutivo de NOAA en el Caribe y ella maneja el programa de desechos marinos en Puerto Rico. Ella ahorita en el momento está en una reunión en las Islas Vírgenes. Ok, next slide, Amy. Ok, excellent. Y aquí también les quiero dar un repaso cortito sobre la presencia del Servicio Meteorológico Nacional. Son los que les traen la programación del clima, de las tormentas tropicales, huracanes, y hay una oficina muy importante precisamente en San Juan, Puerto Rico. Y ellos también se dedican a proporcionar servicios también para las Islas Vírgenes. Ok, next slide, please, Damie. Y también unos colaboradores fuertísimos, claro, es el SIGRA en Puerto Rico y también Caricus. Creo que está aquí con nosotros Yasmín Detres, pero Caricus es fuertísimo, tienen una página increíble y espero que la puedan conocer. Voy a decirle a Damie que por favor pase el sitio web para ambos, SIGRAN y para Caricus, si no lo conocen, pero seguro que ya lo conocen. Fuertísimos colaboradores. Y también les quiero mencionar una cosita importante, es de que las Islas Vírgenes acaba de solicitar un programa para tener un Sea Grant para las Islas Vírgenes. Entonces es un gran acontecimiento. No se ha dado a conocer el proyecto precisamente, pero esperamos que se pueda seguir adelante o empezar en el 2025. Okay, Damie, next slide, please. Y también les quiero dar a conocer que otro programa muy importante para nosotros es la Reserva de la Bahía de Jobos. Y también les quiero dar a conocer que Aurora Justiniano Santos, que nos acompaña hoy, es nuestro enlace entre la NOAA, nuestra oficina de manejo costero, y la Reserva de Jobos NER. Entonces, Aurora ya tiene muchísima experiencia trabajando en Puerto Rico en las áreas de recursos marinos y también fue una colega muy importante en corales y el programa de manejo costero. Otro programa también muy importante es el Caribbean Fishery Management Council. Ese también gestiona ahí en la área para el Caribe. Jamie, next slide, please. Y aquí por último les quiero dar otro programa muy importante para nosotros, es el programa de manejo costero del Departamento de Recursos Naturales de Puerto Rico, y igual el de las Islas Vírgenes, y otros la Oficina de la Conservación de Hábitat y Restauración, que también tienen muchos proyectos muy importantes ahorita precisamente. Next slide, Damie. Y sabemos que ha habido mucha inversión en los últimos 2-3 años por medio de la Ley de Reducción de la Inflación y la Ley Bipartida de Infraestructuras. Entonces aquí les doy a conocer un poco de los anuncios que han salido, de la cantidad de inversiones que ha habido últimamente en el Caribe, lo cual ha traído muchas buenas oportunidades, pero hay mucho más por venir. Next slide, Damie. Y aquí hay una lista, no es completa, pero es un poquito para orientarle el tipo de proyectos e inversiones que ha habido últimamente. Y les vamos a pasar estas notas, estas diapositivas para que puedan ver exactamente a fondo y estudiar un poquito más estos proyectos. Y la segunda página también es otra lista más para que vean que es larga y muy completa. Sé que hay muchas palabras aquí, pero les mandamos más detalles sobre estos proyectos. Next slide. Wonderful, thank you. Y también les quiero dar a conocer un poco de las becas de posgrado que hay dentro de la NOAA, pero también les quiero dar a conocer estas muy buenas noticias de los finalistas de la beca Knaus, que lo proporciona la oficina de Sea Grant. Y tenemos aquí 3 estudiantes que son caribeños o estudian en el Caribe. Entonces les queremos dar a conocer que hay 3 este año. También hay este código QR que pueden escanear para encontrar un poquito más sobre estos fantásticos estudiantes. Lo que también estamos haciendo ahorita, Dami va a poner en el chat un documento que tenemos ahorita para tratar de promover carreras dentro de la NOAA. Sabemos que es complejo solicitar empleo con la NOAA, pero estamos traduciendo esta página en español. Todavía no está completa, pero ahí viene. Y también hemos hecho en el pasado seminarios sobre tips de cómo solicitar empleo con la NOAA. Entonces eso es muy, muy importante, sobre todo para nuestros colaboradores en el Caribe, porque siempre hay posiciones que se abren y hay mucho movimiento. Okay, next slide, Dami. Thank you. Y esta es una pequeña muestra que le hemos dado ahorita en la mañana del gran trabajo que se está realizando entre nuestros colaboradores en Puerto Rico y las Islas Vírgenes. Y les queremos compartir lo que dijo al principio Dami, de que el abril 29 al 1 de mayo va a ser la reunión del Grupo NOAA en el Caribe. Se va a hacer en Puerto Rico. No sabemos exactamente la ubicación, pero pensamos que posiblemente sea en el sur de la isla. Y tendremos aquí un poquito de los highlights que vamos a tocar, un poquito del esfuerzo que hay sobre la nación preparada para el cambio climático. Resaltaremos los logros de nuestros colaboradores, dar a conocer temas emergentes y cómo es trabajar con la NOAA y consejos para obtener puestos de trabajo en la NOAA, como mencioné previamente. Y experiencias con la administración de contratos. Como ya les di a repasar un poquito de los varios programas y proyectos que se están llevando a cabo en el Caribe, un poquito de esa experiencia. Y viene mucho más. Bueno, eso es todo. Si alguien tiene alguna pregunta, creo que tenemos unos minutitos, pero también les quiero dar, ahorita le voy a poner en el chat, tenemos como un diccionario que estamos desarrollando aquí en la NOAA por medio del servicio meteorológico de palabras técnicas en inglés y español para que empecemos a usar esas y normalizar esas palabras técnicas, y ahorita lo voy a poner para que tengan aquí al alcance ese sitio. Bueno, pues muchas gracias, muy amable a todos y espero verlos muy pronto.
Thank you so much, Aranza. It's a wonderful presentation. Always love to hear about the work our group is doing and exciting things on the horizon and how we work with the community. So thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I'm just going to pop in the chat here that dictionary, that glossary that I mentioned. Oh, wonderful. Yasmin put in there the Karaku's website, which is honestly fantastic. I also wanted to mention that they have a sargassum tracking component to that website. And I will also say that sargassum is an up-and-coming topic, too, that we didn't mention, Dami, but we will be working that topic as well at the end of April. So stay tuned.
Lots of details to come. We're really excited about everything that's on the horizon here. Give it another minute if there are any questions.
Oh yeah, and Pablo put in the CCAN program, the NOAA CAP program for the Caribbean, which is really important. Thank you, Pablo. We will make sure that we enter that as another important program. Another important. I just did a quick highlight of some of them, but I did not certainly exhaust the list. So thank you.
And we'll be sure that all of these links and all the resources shared today and discussed will follow up in an email with all of the notes and recordings. So you can always reference any of these wonderful resources. Not seeing any questions. I think we'll move to closing out our meeting today. Again, a huge thank you to our wonderful NOAA in the Caribbean executive team. You heard from Lee, Alyssa, and Aranzazu. We're really grateful to have such wonderful leadership on our executive team to be able to present all of these wonderful resources. So thank you all for attending today and being engaged and asking wonderful questions. We're really proud of all of the work that is being done. At this point, if anyone has any updates that they would like to share with the community, you are welcome to come off mute, raise your hand, share in chat. By no means are you required to. Again, any updates you ever want to share with the community, please send to caribbeannews@noaa.gov. We're always happy to share things. Let's see. Yes. Go ahead and come off mute if you'd like to share your announcement.
Sure. Thank you. Good morning. Quickly, we're in the process of planning the Puerto Rico chapter of the Association of State Floodplain Managers, which will be hosted by the Puerto Rico Science, Technology, and Research Trust and its program, the Caribbean Center for Rising Seas. So more to come. We're engaged with your Region 4 to try to be a training center or a place where training for the NOAA, all of these wonderful resources can be accessed. So just wanted to share that with the group. Thank you.
Thank you, Gilberto. Once you have more information, please feel free to send it to us, and we'd be happy to send it to our listserv. We have over 800 people on it, so we can really help spread that information if you'd like to share that with us. Perfect. I see the link now. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay, a few other updates that we have received from the community. The Caribbean Conservation Community of Practice meeting is coming up. That will be March 25th through 27th in St. Thomas at the University of Virgin Islands. I'll input the announcement here. You can reach out to Alexandria if you have any questions. And you are invited to participate in the Aquafest, Clean Waters, Healthy Communities, a solution-oriented festival. There will be different educators from Puerto Rico and USVI on aquatic debris topics from microplastics to abandoned vessels, workshops, art, and music. And this is December 7th in Cabo Rojo. And if you have any information, please contact the chair of NOAA in the Caribbean, Yaritza. And I'm going to share that announcement in the chat now. And with that, thank you all for coming. Our next community group meeting is going to be January 17th. It will be 10:30 to 12 AT and 9:30 to 11 ET, same time as the meeting today. As always, if you ever have any questions, please do not hesitate to reach out. We love to hear from you all. We are here to share stories of success, resources, anything and everything. So again, you can reach us at caribbeannews@noaa.gov. But we will go ahead and close out the meeting. Thank you all for coming today and just being a absolutely wonderful community.